Carling Bassett. Before there was Bianca Andreescu and before Eugenie Bichard, there was another young female tennis star that captured the hearts and imagination of the Canadian public. In many ways, she was close to being Canadian royalty, much like Princess Anne in equestrian or JFK in sailing. Carling Bassett was a Canadian celebrity athlete. Her very name, not just her surname, was the combination of two prominent Canadian families from which she was born. If you're watching my channel because you're a big fan of the 80s, then you may remember Carling or Carly from her rapid rise to the number 8 ranking in women's tennis in 1985, or maybe you remember her starring with Susan Anton in the 1982 motion picture Spring Fever, where she played, well, a young and upcoming tennis star. Born in 1967, Carling progressed to be the second highest ranked junior tennis player in the world. She turned pro in 1983, won her first tournament that year, and reached the quarterfinals in the Australian Open. In her second year, 1984, she reached the quarterfinals in the French Open, but then went on in the US Open to reach the semifinals, where she lost to Chris Evert. Bassett was named the WTA's Most Impressive Newcomer in 1983 and Canada's Female Athlete of the Year in 1983 and 1985. If you want to know where that drive came from to be the best at such a young age, then you need to look no further than her father, John Bassett, who doubled as her best friend, partly because they were so similar. You see, the name Carling Bassett comes from the combination of two iconic families, the Bassetts and the Carlings. Carling's father, John, was a rebel and a sportsman from a long line of entrepreneurs. Carling's great-grandfather, John, they were all called John, was a publisher of the Montreal Gazette newspaper. His son, Carling's grandfather, moved the family's business interest to Toronto, where he was publisher, then owner of the Toronto Telegram. Amongst his business interests were partial owner of the NHL's Toronto Maple Leafs and CFL's Toronto Argonauts. In fact, at one point, he probably could have bought out his partners Harold Ballard and Stafford Smythe and become sole owner of the historic Maple Leafs. But as fate would have it, they bought him out instead. His son John, Carling's father, though, would continue that sports legacy. Not only was John a good hockey player, at one point being offered a contract with the Leafs before his family owned a piece of it, but his father would not allow him to pursue it. John played football in college, had some knee injuries, but still went on to be a good enough tennis player to represent Canada in the Davis Cup. He would later take up squash and reach the Canadian semifinals. John pursued a career in media and then branched out to sports management and ownership. He is probably best known for his role in owning and running the USFL's Tampa Bay Bandits in the 1980s, but also owned interests in the World Hockey Association's Toronto Toros and two other teams, plus teams in the World Football League and team tennis. He was pretty much attached to any upstart rebel leagues from the 1970s and 80s. He was also a film producer, including having produced a tennis movie, Spring Fever, yes, the one that starred his daughter Carling, in her only major theatrical role. Also fascinating is that of all the grandchildren, it was Carling, or Carly for short, that received that name, which came from her mother's side of the family, the Carlings. If you're familiar with Carling beer, especially in Britain, well, this is the family that founded that brewery. It was founded in Canada in 1840 by Thomas Carling, was later sold to Canadian breweries and became Carling O'Keefe, then merged with Molson's, then with Coors. But interestingly enough, it was introduced to Britain in 1952 and by the 1980s was Britain's top-selling beer by volume. I remember being in Gibraltar a couple years ago and it was the most prevalent beer I saw on the main strip. Anyway, Carling Bassett's maternal grandfather was John Carling, the son of founder Thomas Carling. So if the name Carling Bassett seems like it resulted from the merging of law firms or maybe CPAs, you're not too far off. It was the merger of a media and sports family with a political and brewing family. So Carling's tennis career took off, and while her acting was perhaps nepotism, she continued to do many advertisements and sponsorships.
Getting beat by my daughter isn't new.
What's new is C+ non-carbonated drink. I really like the taste of new C+.
Interviews with Carling at the time showed a typical teenager obsessed with boys and flirting, saying she liked tennis players preferably cool, detached, and without braces. Despite this, she had the family's drive to succeed. Her tennis career, though, stagnated, and in 1986 was hampered by a thumb injury incurred while lifting weights, and then tendinitis in the same thumb. And the biggest blow came in May of that year when her father passed away after suffering with 2 brain tumors. During his dying days, he kept his condition secret for as long as possible, including sheltering his kids from the reality of how bad it was. Carly lost not only her dad and her best friend, but a primary driver of her will to succeed. Going along with that loss and the injuries was the fact that Carling was secretly dealing with her own disease, eating disorders, specifically bulimia. Eating disorders were not seen as the same way back then as a disease. Instead, they were scorned as an irrational choice. She did not seek help, instead living with the disease and attempting to treat it on her own. Having lost a bit of her focus on tennis, Carling met American tennis player Robert Seguso on tour in 1987. Seguso was considered a double specialist. After just a short whirlwind romance, the pair were married, and in March of 1988 had their first of 5 kids. Carly tried her best to resume her tennis career, but between raising kids, following and supporting her husband's tennis career, and continuing to battle bulimia, she never really got back on track. She had 1 career tournament win, her highest ranking was number 8 in the world, and her career WTA earnings were just under $700,000. Carly and Robert remained married, and Carly returned to tennis as a coach. She soon found out that while she was a good coach for other people's kids, she had trouble teaching her own children as she was too competitive and had lost perspective. She continues to deal with her eating disorder, but is now not only public with her struggle, but also receives professional medical care. Like in so many other life ventures, a career in competitive sports can be much tougher on women than it is on men. The physical and emotional commitment required to start and raise a family, society's expectations of gender roles, pressure to remain physically fit and attractive, and doing all this with less monetary support than their male counterparts can be too much for many female athletes. While Carling's tennis and acting career may never reach their full potential, it would be hard to say that she is not in a better position in life today than she may have ended up, considering all the adversity and attention she faced. Growing up in Canada in the 80s, I remember fondly how popular this young tennis phenom was when Carly Mania gripped the Great White North. Thanks for listening.